Chapter 5. I forget altogether how it was that I escaped, whether by the window or the door. I only know that I found myself a moment later making great speed over the moor, followed by screaming birds and shouting winds, straight on the track downhill toward the manor house. Something must have guided me, for I went with the instinct of an animal, having no uncertainties as to the turnings, and I saw the welcome lights of windows before I had covered another mile. And all the way I felt as though a great sluice gate had been opened to let a flood of new perceptions rush like a sea over my inner being, so that I was half ashamed and half delighted, partly angry, yet partly happy. Servants met me at the door, several of them, and I was aware at once of an atmosphere of commotion in the house. I arrived breathless and hatless, wet to the skin, my hands scratched, and my boots caked with mud. "We made sure you were lost, sir," I heard the old butler say, and I heard my own reply, faintly, like the voice of someone else. I thought so, too. A minute later, I found myself in the study with the old folklorist standing opposite. In his hands, he held the book I had brought down for him in my bag, ready addressed. There was a curious smile on his face. "It never occurred to me that he would dare to walk, tonight of all nights," he was saying. I stared without a word. I was bursting with the desire to tell him something of what had happened, and tried to be patient with his explanations, but when I sought for words and sentences, my story seemed suddenly flat and pointless, and the details of my adventure began to evaporate and melt away and seemed hard to remember. "I had an exciting walk," I stammered, still a little breathless from running. "The weather was all right when I started from the station." "The weather is all right still," he said, "though you may have found some evening mist on top of the hills. But it's not that I meant." "What then?" "I meant," he said, still laughing quizzically, "that you were a very brave man to walk tonight over the enchanted hills, because this is May Day Eve, and on May Day Eve, you know, they have power over the minds of men, and can put glamour upon the imagination." "Who they? What do you mean?" He put my book down on the table beside him and looked quietly for a moment into my eyes, and as he did so, the memory of my adventure began to revive in detail, and I thought quickly of the shadowy man who had shown me the way first. What could it have been in the face of the old folklorist that made me think of this man? A dozen things ran like flashes through my excited mind, and while I attempted to seize them, I heard the old man's voice continue. He seemed to be talking to himself as much to me. "The elemental beings you have always scoffed at, of course, they who operate ceaselessly behind the screen of appearances, and who fashion and mold the moods of the mind. And an extremist like you, for extremes are always dangerously weak, is their legitimate prey." "Pshaw!" I interrupted him, knowing that my manner betrayed me hopelessly, and that he had guessed much. "Any man may have subjective experiences, I suppose." Then I broke off suddenly. The change in his face made me start. It had taken on, for the moment, so exactly the look of the man on the hillside. The eyes gazing so steadily into mine had shadows in them, I thought. "Glamour," he was saying. "All glamour. One of them must have come very close to you, or perhaps touched you." Then he asked sharply, "Did you meet anyone? Did you speak with anyone?" "I came by Tom Bassett's cottage," I said. "I didn't feel quite sure of my way, and I went in and asked." "All glamour," he repeated to himself, and then aloud to me. "And as for Bassett's cottage, it was burnt down 3 years ago, and nothing stands there now but broken, roofless walls." He stopped, because I had seized him by the arm. In the shadows of the lamp-lit room behind him, I thought I caught sight of dim forms moving past the bookshelves. But when my eye tried to focus them, they faded and slipped away again into ceiling and walls. The details of the hilltop cottage, however, started into life again at the sight, and I seized my friend's arm to tell him. But instantly, when I tried, it all faded away again as though it had been a dream, and I could recall nothing intelligible to repeat to him. He looked at me and laughed. "They always obliterate the memory afterwards," he said gently, "so that little remains beyond a mood or an emotion, to show how profoundly deep their touch has been. Though sometimes part of the change remains and becomes permanent, as I hope in your case it may." Then, before I had time to answer, to swear or to remonstrate, he stepped briskly past me and closed the door into the hall, and then drew me aside farther into the room. The change that I could not understand was still working in his face and eyes. "If you have courage enough left to come with me," he said, speaking very seriously, "we will go out again and see more. Up till midnight, you know, there is still the opportunity, and with me, perhaps, you won't feel so... It was impossible somehow to refuse. Everything combined to make me go. We had a little food, and then went out into the hall, and he clapped a wide awake on his grey hairs. I took a cloak and seized a walking stick from the stand. I really hardly knew what I was doing. The new world I had awakened to still seemed a quiver about me. As we passed out on the gravel drive, the light from the hall windows fell upon his face, and I saw that the change I had been so long observing was nearing its completeness, for there breathed about him that keen, wonderful atmosphere of eternal youth I had felt upon the inmates of the cottage. He seemed to have gone back 40 years. A veil was gathering over his eyes, and I could have sworn that somehow his stature had increased, and that he moved beside me with the vigor and power I had never seen in him before. And as we began to climb the hill together in silence, I saw that the stars were clear overhead, and there was no mist, that the trees stood motionless without wind, and that beyond us, on the summit of the hills, there were lights dancing to and fro, appearing and disappearing, like the inflection of stars in water.